Melissa J. Strong, an alumna of Central Connecticut State University, is a professor at Community College of Philadelphia.
Thank you. I am so happy to be here. Thank you to Dr. Sissel and Dr. Gelati for organizing this event, and thank you all for coming today. My studies at CCSU planted some seeds that later blossomed into the research that became this book, and I'm grateful for it. We're here today to talk about American Lit Remixed, so let me share my plan for that. First, I will define remix theory. Next, I will discuss how my book applies remix theory to literature and share examples. And I will wrap up by putting my research in context of broader debates. To begin, remix theory is a term coined by Eduardo Navas, a professor of digital arts and media design at Penn State. Dr. Navas researches the intersection of art and media and culture, and he collaborates with artists and institutions around the world to develop new forms of publication and creative production. Sounds pretty cool, right? In 2012, Dr. Navas published the book Remix Theory, The Aesthetics of Sampling, which explains his ideas about remix theory and its importance in our world today. Dr. Navas's book analyzes visual art, music, and new media. Applying remix theory to literature was my idea, and Dr. Navas gave American Lit Remixed his blessing and a thumbs up. Now let's talk about remix theory. First, we need to define the term remix. It may mean something specific to everyone here, and for the purposes of my research, remix means to mix again, and it typically refers to music. Musical remixes transform an existing sound recording into a new version, usually by making sonic adjustments, changing the song's arrangement or structure, reworking the original's aesthetic, or combining these strategies. Official or sanctioned remixes often give songs new life and popularity, and some examples include the following. The 1978 remix of Donna Summer's I Feel Love, which stretches the classic tune into 15 minutes of disco. The early 2000s version of A Little Less Conversation, which transformed a forgotten 1968 Elvis song into a worldwide hit. And the 1997 remix of It's Like That, which gave Run DMC's 1983 debut single new life by blurring the lines between hip-hop and dance music. Are you with me so far? Okay, good. Remember Eduardo Navas. About a decade ago, he looked around and noticed that today, remixes may be about more than music. According to Navas, remix practices have found their way into daily life in the 21st century, and they do not always relate to music. Instead, Navas reimagines the musical remix as a mode of discourse. What this means is that remix practices like the ones I described, making changes to another person's creation to give it a new sound, aesthetic, relevance, or meaning, now infuse various forms of cultural expression. For this reason, Navas argues that the remix constitutes a type of cultural binder that includes art, media, and culture. Looking at mainstream movies, I can see his point. Reboots and spin-offs remix familiar stories and establish franchises, from Star Wars to superheroes to James Bond. Navas even sees the remix in electronic cut, copy, paste functions, and he describes these keyboard shortcuts as an extension of the sampling practices of late 20th century DJs. These are the most popular forms of sampling practiced by anyone who has access to a computer or a smartphone, according to Navas. When I discovered these ideas about remixes, I had already decided to write a book about music in 21st century American literature. I also had decided that my book would explore positive, constructive qualities, even though many readers and scholars focus on dystopian and ominous themes in today's literature, media, and popular culture. Remix theory gave me a framework for doing both of these things. First, it led me to interpret 21st century writing as remixing the literary modernism of the early 20th century, which emphasized creative innovation through borrowing and reinterpreting traditions from other cultures and the past. Meanwhile, contemporary writers build atop the late 20th century's postmodernism, polyvocality, and multi-ethnic voices and perspectives, which itself was built upon modernism. Make it new was the modernist slogan, and American Lit Remixed argues that music and sound recording technologies offer a means of making literature new again for the digital era. Second, all this seems particularly important when we consider that most people agree that the digital revolution negatively impacted music and publishing industries. Applying remix theory, which emphasizes creativity, possibility, and accessibility to literature, made it possible for my book to identify opportunities for connection, hope, and creation that challenge the disconnect and disaffection that permeate life in the digital age. I developed these ideas before I ever heard of coronavirus. And as I was telling Dr. Sissel before this talk, I wrote this book during the pandemic. The pandemic has only added more challenges to living, writing, studying, creating, and relating. And it makes creativity, optimism, and human connection more necessary than ever. American Lit Remixed addresses this through connecting the musical remix's potential for creating the new out of the old to literature. I argue that fiction, poetry, and drama emerging since the digital revolution remix analog-era music and technology to create literary innovations as well as personal possibilities for characters and for readers. The book has necessarily focused parameters since it cannot address every author and every text. It emphasizes work since 2009 because by that time, the digital revolution had begun transforming the lives of many Americans. For example, portable digital audio players such as the iPod had become affordable by the end of the 2000s, and they combined with innovations like broadband internet and streaming to forever change the music industry as well as how we create and consume music and other media. Consider how technology and media consumption continue to change. These days, most people use smartphones, not iPods, to stream music. Equally important, literature of the digital era entered a post-9/11 world full of tensions regarding security, surveillance, privacy, identity, and belonging. In this bummer of a landscape, American Lit Remixed finds that musical elements allow literature to forge new ways of relating to other texts, to history and time, to ourselves and to each other. Now that we've talked about how my book applies remix theory to literature, let's look at some examples. One of the texts I discuss in American Lit Remixed is A Visit from the Goon Squad by Jennifer Egan, which won the 2011 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. How many of you have heard of this book? Okay, how many have read it? Just us. All right, awesome. Okay, so for some relevant context, let me say a few words about Egan's approach to fiction. So this is just her as a writer before I say more about A Visit from the Goon Squad. Her goal as an artist is writing each work in a different genre, rather than establishing a distinct voice or style as a fiction writer, which is pretty unique. She's written a neo-Gothic novel called The Keep that was published in 2006. She's also written a historical novel called Manhattan Beach that was published in 2017. The book I'm looking at is A Visit from the Goon Squad, and that one does not fit into an established genre. It has been described alternately as a novel or interconnected short stories or nothing at all, really. Egan herself didn't want to call her book anything like that, but she realized that if you don't call a book a novel or short stories, it doesn't sell. So it was really trying to sell books that made her choose novel. But she herself characterizes Goon Squad as a concept album. So it's a book, but she calls it a concept album. It's a work of literature in a musical genre. She explains that she drew inspiration from the great storytelling albums she grew up with in the 1970s, such as The Who's Tommy, David Bowie's The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, and Pink Floyd's The Wall. It's easy to see that music is important in A Visit from the Goon Squad. Several of its characters play music or work in the music industry, and a few chapters explore their thoughts about particular songs, artists, and recording technologies. The novel has two parts that are labeled A and B, like the two sides of a record or a cassette. The first edition of the book even features cover art that resembles the iconic poster promoting the 3 days of peace and music at Woodstock in 1969. However, I interpret Goon Squad as a mixtape rather than a concept album. The storytelling albums that Egan mentions contain linear and chronological narratives, but Goon Squad rejects these conventions. The novel jumps backward and forward in time, and the narrative contains gaps. Some scholars see this as reflecting a dissolution reminiscent of punk rock. I see it differently. Reading Goon Squad as a mixtape raises creative possibilities hiding like hope at the bottom of Pandora's box. And let me clarify that I use the historical late 20th century definition of mixtape, a recording usually on cassette consisting of songs typically by various artists that are selected and arranged by a single person. The classic mixtape makes meaning of musical fragments and suggests a connection between them. Often it has a message. Interpreting Goon Squad as a mixtape makes sense of its adoption of a loose, polyvocal, thematic organization rather than a linear, chronological narrative with a single protagonist. Moreover, the musical pauses in Goon Squad symbolize opportunities for self-development and connection with others. The 12th chapter focuses on rock songs containing pauses. Set in the near future in a drought-ravaged California, the chapter famously experiments with literary form by solely consisting of PowerPoint slides. The slides comprise several entries in a 12-year-old girl's diary. And I interpret this diary as delving into the intentional silences in famous songs, in which the music and singing stop before restarting. And I see the 12-year-old girl as relating these to her own life. She listens to and studies these songs, and it helps Allison to experience time differently. I argue that the imagined eternity of the pause contains a unique possibility of stopping time by bridging the past and the future, and music is central to this. We see this in one of Allison's PowerPoint slides, which tracks the power of pauses in 13 songs largely recorded before the digital era. Many hail from rock's golden age, such as Bernadette, Foxy Lady, The Time of the Season, Good Times, Bad Times, Long Train Runnin', Young Americans, and Roxanne. Although the chart includes music from various eras, all of the songs were recorded before Allison was born. She applies the creative possibilities of musical pauses to her understanding and experience of time in ways that generate transformative potential. Sometimes time expands for her, and sometimes the past and the present telescope together. For instance, Allison's diary describes a long walk with her father as lasting several years. But Allison's time play is not a mere adolescent exaggeration. As we see in her slide Walking to the Car, where Allison uses PowerPoint to demonstrate multiple layers of perception during a single moment in her life. The slide visually portrays simultaneous actions as two collections of shapes, rectangles and pie chart pieces. And I see the shapes as documenting Allison's multi-layered reality, with the rectangles portraying her outward self and the pie chart pieces reflecting her inner self. On the outside, Allison is interacting with others, including her brother and her mother. But while all of this happens, the inner Allison pauses to think about the temperature of the air and the asphalt, even stopping to touch it. As she does, she makes an observation, noticing that the parking lot glitters like coal in the moonlight. And this shows her keen awareness of her surroundings, and that Allison has learned to occupy fully even mundane moments of her life in the same way that she learned to appreciate pauses in recorded music. We can see Allison's growing awareness of and appreciation for time, reflection, and connection in her chart tracking the power of musical pauses alongside a slide that depicts a real moment in her life. This allows Allison to savor and fully appreciate and inhabit moments in her life in a way that few of us do in the digital age, especially younger people. Now, I could talk about Goon Squad all day, but it's just one of the literary works addressed in my book. So let's switch gears and I'll explore another example. Anne Washburn's play, Mr. Burns, a post-electric play from 2012. So I'll ask again, how many of you have heard of this play? Okay, a couple of us. How many have seen it or read it? Just me? Okay. I didn't expect that many people would be familiar, so let me share some background. The play Mr. Burns begins after the collapse of civilization. Those who survive an unspecified disaster live without electricity, heat, internet, and supplies. The first act of Mr. Burns takes place in the very near future, soon after this apocalypse. The second act takes place 7 years after that, and the third act is set 75 years after Act 2. Washburn's notes on the play explain that it was inspired by pondering the significance of popular culture within the broad scope of human existence. Mr. Burns, the play, asks, what would happen to a pop culture narrative pushed past the fall of civilization? And then it answers this question with carefully considered and chillingly plausible educated guesses that draw from remix theory. The play's title comes from an episode of The Simpsons, which gets recycled and remixed throughout the 3 acts. Which episode? It's the one called Cape Fear, with an E, from the 5th season in 1993, when the family goes into hiding to protect themselves after Bart receives death threats from Sideshow Bob. That Simpsons episode becomes both subject and medium for Washburn's play. In Act 1, Cape Fear provides a means of connecting with strangers and preserving culture and community. The characters don't have the same streaming services that we relied on to get through COVID, so remembering an old TV show episode becomes a source of entertainment and comfort as they shelter in a bunker. Survivors bond over nostalgia for items such as Diet Coke. The Simpsons episode deepens the connection between survivors, becoming a kind of campfire story that as characters comb their memories to collectively piece together the plot from memory. When fear and conflict arise among the survivors, resuming the communal retelling of the Cape Fear episode soothes tensions and reestablishes their connections with each other. As they do, Cape Fear helps draw everyone back into community, familiarity, and a sense of safety. The Cape Fear episode serves as both subject and medium for the play as it creates a dramatic innovation reminiscent of Jennifer Egan's concept album/mixtape novel. In Act 2 of Mr. Burns, the survivors recreate the episode as a live performance to entertain other survivors. Then, Act 3 casts Cape Fear as a hagiographic ritual that conveys both the story of both the story of the Cape Fear episode and the story of the apocalypse. And music is integral to these latter 2 iterations, which allows the play to give popular music the same treatment as the animated series. Mr. Burns mines turn-of-the-millennium pop songs for cultural significance, transforming their pleasant banalities into strange, haunting memorials for the dead. In other words, The Simpsons initially provides solace and fosters connection among survivors, and then later, it's an animated relic of a lost civilization that becomes an allegory for its demise. American Lit Remixed focuses on how Mr. Burns remixes The Simpsons, and I have much more to say about that, but in the interest of brevity, I will describe the use of music in Act 2 before wrapping up. The live-action performance of Cape Fear in Act 2 contains interludes consisting of popular music from before the apocalypse. The players in this play within a play perform an enthusiastic medley for an effect that Washburn's notes describe as highly choreographed, polished, entertaining, and without irony. Much like a music video or a stadium concert, right? Yet an almost overwhelming sense of reality infuses their singing of top 40 hits so that deep tragedy undercuts the apparent humor of the moment. In the 2018 performance I saw at the Wilma Theater in Philadelphia, the medley included En Vogue's My Lovin', You're Never Gonna Get It. Sung by the actors in the play within the play, the refrain from My Lovin', never gonna get it, never gonna get it, suggests a eulogy for the lost world of carbonated drinks, electricity, and other resources and comforts we rely on and take for granted. Even more tragically, Mr. Burns asks the audience to imagine a future in which a catchy R&B song from 1992 is what future humans remember of us. But in the end, the popular culture from the lost civilization helps the civilization of the future understand itself and its predecessors. To sum up, American Lit Remixed draws upon remix theory to show that diverse texts use music and musical forms in important ways. Music helps writers like Anne Washburn and Jennifer Egan develop new literary forms while grappling with key issues of the 21st century. Issues like identity, belonging, nostalgia, the real versus the artificial, and the impact of technology on the human experience. Tracing these themes through a visit from the Goon Squad, Mr. Burns, and other texts highlights the singular opportunities for artistic innovation and human connection. At the same time, these innovations build upon the legacy of borrowing, endemic to literature, music, and other art forms. Other scholars have observed musical elements in literary fiction, but they tend to focus on rock novels. My book addresses a wide variety of musical styles and forms across multiple literary genres. And having written this book, I now see literary remixes everywhere, including my city's creative writing scene. Philadelphia-based poet Roberto Carlos Garcia created a poetry form called the mixtape that blends the cento with rap lyrics and other literary modes. My colleague at CCP, Kathleen Murphy, remixes fairy tales to be more inclusive, creating versions like The Frog and the Transgender Prince. I hope other scholars will delve further into the intersection of music and 21st century literature. Future research might consider the many American writers whose work engages with music, including Tommy Orange, Jacqueline Woodson, and James McBride. Moreover, several books could be written on literary connections to particular kinds of pop music beyond rock, like jazz and hip-hop. I also hope that other scholars will investigate music in contemporary global literatures, such as in the work of Japanese author Haruki Murakami and Norwegian writer Karl Ove Knausgaard. Music may capture the attention of writers across the globe because it retains its power to create and connect despite the distractions of the often impersonal digital age. I'd like to thank you for listening and for joining me for today. And in closing, I'll mention that American Lit Remixed has a Spotify playlist. It has all the songs that I discuss in the book, and I would be happy to share, so see me afterwards if you're interested. And you can also reach me on my website, which is melissajstrong.com. Thank you.
We have time for questions.
Yes.
I'll start. So did your own taste in music shape, sort of the things you chose by any chance when you were writing the book?
That's a great question. It was more about the authors and what they were doing, and so for that reason, the playlist for the book is all over the place. Yeah, it's like indie folk and classic rock and Patti Smith and Taylor Swift. It's all over the map. So I didn't choose based on music, but rather what the authors were doing with musical form.
Although, is the Egan book influenced at all by Elvis Costello's Goon Squad, which is the song that's raging in my head right now?
That's right. She's been asked about that. I believe that the title of the work comes from a line of dialogue where one character says to another that time is a goon. And then sort of the frame for the book is Proust, In Search of Lost Time. And that's really what the book is about in a lot of ways. And that's why the musical pauses are important. And the characters are obsessed with them. And I'm like, that's what I'm really looking at there. So I guess it's more about the structure. And I think people have asked Egan about Elvis Costello, and she doesn't know. She really, again and again has mentioned Pink Floyd, David Bowie, and things like that. Yeah.
Were there any books or authors that kind of left on the cutting room floor that you wanted to write about, but just didn't have time or didn't have?
Yeah, I mean, I could have written like 10 books on this topic, and I had to narrow it down. So, and as I said, like a lot of people have done work on rock in fiction, and I really wanted to go beyond that. So I mentioned a work of fiction here, and then a play, but I have a whole chapter that's on plays and performance, which is kind of unusual. And then I have I talk about poetry as well. So there were authors I could not address, and I mentioned some of those. I envisioned writing about Arthur Phillips's The Song Is You. I envisioned something with Jacqueline Woodson and James McBride and maybe Tommy Orange, and I just, I couldn't get to all of it.
Murakami was one of the first ones.
Yes, exactly. And so since I'm limited to American, I didn't specifically talk about him, but I do mention all of his work because Norwegian wood and like the classical stuff and everything that he does. So maybe some of you here today will continue this research on international writers.
Yeah, I just recently Bob Dylan, I think that's him,
Yeah.
won the Nobel Prize for Literature.
Yes.
I don't know if there's any connection between, if you find any connection between his work and what you do.
It's a question for you, Dennis. I mean.
Bob Dylan? I'm sure Bob Dylan was quite influenced by your book.
Well, I mean, okay, so I did my graduate work at the University of California, and I had a professor there who taught a course on Bob Dylan. So, like, I think, a whole course could be taught on Bob Dylan. I think books could be written on his songs and his contributions to American popular music and culture. And I don't think there's any Bob Dylan in my book, though.
Go ahead.
Oh, two things. Hello.
Hi, good to see you.
It's good to see you too, and I recommend people check out the chapter on the plays too.
Yes.
That's good stuff. Going in two directions here.
Yeah.
One is I know you made distinctions between a remix and mixtapes. But,
Yes.
when I think of mixtapes, it's like you give it to your significant other. It's like almost like
Right.
a dating gift or something.
Right,
And-
there's a message, yeah.
and I don't know, sort of where, courtship, little sort of, token of love, how that fits into the remix thing and the relationship between, like Simpsons and Lit or whatever it is. But
Yeah.
So that was one thing, and then just totally disconnected from that, you got me thinking about things like the Golden Shovel poem. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that's a poet who, I'm forgetting the name of the poet, took Gwendolyn Brooks's We Real Cool and sort of made her poem the final, strung it out and made it into another poem that each line ends with one word from We Real Cool, and that's become now a whole new form. That's another kind of remixing, although it's not music per se. So
Right.
I either, or it's not exactly a coherent question or questions, but I don't know if any of this is a springboard for something more meaningful from you.
Yeah, I'm going to try to weave these strands together, and I'll say first that Professor Gilmore was my advisor when I was a student here. Okay, so you do work on Sarah Rule too, right?
Well, a little bit.
Okay,
Yeah.
So I talk about Sarah Rule in the chapter on drama, and she has a play called Eurydice, which takes the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice and kind of looks at it from Eurydice's point of view, because her perspective is not part of the myth. Like, she goes down to Hades and then gets stuck there. So it's like, what if Eurydice told this story, but then she also took the myth and she combined it with her experience of mourning her father. So it's a remix that blends a classical Greek myth with a personal experience, and then to interweave the mixtape component, it is kind of a love letter to her father at the same time, with Peter Pan being the love letter to her mother. So I think you're right. Like, a mixtape is, there's a message, and it's something that's sort of arranged and curated, often by somebody who doesn't record music, and that's why I described it as accessible. And I guess, like, this book constitutes my mixtape, for the world, with this message that I'm trying to put forth.
Any thoughts about mixing, remixing, and this whole new thing with artificial intelligence, ChatGPT?
Oh my gosh, ChatGPT,
I know that's not
yeah.
music-based
Yeah,
necessarily,
yeah,
but it certainly
yeah.
could potentially impact literature.
That's right.
And maybe even music eventually.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, at my college, there are a lot of conversations right now about ChatGPT and academic honesty, and that's kind of the focus there. And but I have also heard that, that this artificial intelligence has the capacity to, write creative works. I'm not sure. I guess the future will tell us. I really don't know how it's going to impact the literary scene.
There was some news story about a fake Drake tune.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
people
AI
are
Drake.
Like, have Drake sing about this.
Yeah.
There
Interesting.
already is.
Yeah.
So what are you working on now?
I'm still recovering from this book. Yeah, I mean, honestly, so I did learn to play ukulele while I wrote the book, and I'm thinking about like some open mics and things like that. For the ukulele, I write for Movie John, which is it was started as a zine in Philly, and it's a writing collective dedicated to the love of music. And now it has a website and a podcast and all these other things. And it's the 10th anniversary is approaching.
It's dedicated to the love of movies.
What did I say? Music. Oh, dedicated to the love of film. Thank you. Yes, I misspoke, because all of my loves are coming together here today, music and writing and film. Dedicated to the love of film, that's right. And so I dream of an anthology of the best writing from Movie John, and possibly editing that, but I don't quote me on that. I have to talk to the team about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.